Hello, folks. Welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. I'm excited for every episode. That's just that's just how it goes. This episode is interesting in that I was thinking about preparation for this Esalen workshop that Rodney Waters and I are leading in February 27th through March 3rd, I think. And the topic of the conversation or the workshop is ecstatic experience, music, and Jung's Red Book. And Dr. Murray Stein and I shared a conversation years ago on episode 35 when it was just audio on The Sacred Speaks. And it was a great conversation. We talked about the soul and minding the self, one of his books. He's been a leader in this field, has written countless books. And when I started thinking about the Red Book, I realized I wanted to chat with him about this particular book, Jung's Liber Novus. And it's one of the most important books of my library. I'm very excited to explore the book. I was excited to read it again, and it deepened my understanding. I mean, taking another pass at this book has been very thrilling. I highly recommend it. So I want to introduce a couple of ideas here, things we've got going on at a couple of spots where I am, and then introduce Dr. Stein. So like I said, check out our Esalen workshop. There is a link below in the show notes, and it's going to be a cool experience. We've got an experiential component, and the hope is to actually do work with active imagination, and we'll talk more about that in the interview, what that is, if you don't know. So I'd like to tip the hat here to the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. This is a boutique integrative clinic, psychotherapy, acupuncture, and other modalities. This is a wellness center my wife and I created years ago. Check us out at thecenterforhas.com. Again, link below. Also, just to connect with a meaningful place while we're talking about Jung's Red Book, I want to give a shout out to the Jung Center in Houston. Check it out at junghouston.org. Link below. And while we're at it, the music for the podcast has always been from Modern Nations. Check them out at modernnationsmusic.com. Wait around till the end of the episode. You'll get to hear the full selection of the song Clouds. Thanks, guys, for always letting me use that material. So let me get to Murray's information. I want to read his bio and then talk a little bit about his work. Dr. Stein is a graduate of Yale University with a BA and an MDiv, the University of Chicago with a doctorate, a PhD, and the C.G. Jung Institute. He's got a diploma there. He's a founding member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts and the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts. He's been the president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology from 2001 to 4, and the president of the International School of Analytical Psychology, Zurich, from 2008 to 2012. As you'll learn, he is, I think, one of the most perfect people to talk about this book with. He referenced, I only have 2 volumes, and you'll see what a flub that was. He's got 5 volumes with Thomas Arzt, and there is Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. This is an anthology, and Dr. Stein is, along with Thomas Arzt, is an editor on the volume. There are 5 of them. There are about 70 essays on Jung's Red Book, so look that up. Also, there are a couple links below with some lectures that Dr. Stein's been involved in bringing together people to talk about the Red Book. So it was more than I feel very affirmed in my idea to connect with Murray. Thank you, Murray, for your time and for your willingness to connect in this way. Again, check out the Esalen class. Please send it around, let people know about it. And regarding the podcast, check it out at thesacredspeaks.com. And please like, share, and subscribe. This project is growing and growing, and I need your help. So please click the subscribe button, send it along to people that you think would enjoy these conversations. And for now, we'll leave it there with enormous gratitude for tuning in. Thank you. Murray, really awesome. Thank you. Thank you for being spontaneous. Thank you for engaging in this conversation. Dr. Murray Stein, as I look at your bio and your history and what you currently do, you represent a collision of all kinds of different value systems that I'm curious about. I'm looking at your bachelor's, your MDiv, your work in psychology and religion, your doctorate in Chicago, and then in Jungian analytic training. And then, of course, you've written extensively on the Red Book. I know you've been thinking about this a lot. So I know we want to get into some of these books of yours, the anthology that you and Thomas Arzt are working on. I'm assuming a third volume will be out soon. But also talk about this, the Red Book. I sent this, curious fishing line out to you because I'm leading, along with Rodney Waters, we're leading a workshop at Esalen on ecstatic experience, music, and Jung's Red Book. And when I started contemplating the Red Book, I immediately thought of you. We've shared one conversation before in the podcast, and now we get an opportunity for the second. So if we could begin, I'd really like to explore what this book means to you now, how you relate to it, what you think about it, what you've learned about it, just anything that you can start free associating about, and we'll see where we go.
Well, I continue learning from it, and in preparation for our conversation today, I was reading some passages that were suggested by your questions, your comments, and I'm always turning up something that surprises me. It's an amazing text,
yeah.
And Sonu Shamdasani's footnotes. If you follow those and down the tracks that they lead you, you uncover so much about Jung's thinking that is there and latent, but you hadn't really paid so much attention to. So I want to thank you for your prodding. And it did put me on to this connection to the Orphic mysteries that I'd looked at before, but I have a few things to say about that. But first, I'd just like to say that since the Red Book was published in 2009, it's been kind of a constant companion, I would say. It has remained on my desk. I usually am working with this version of it, the reader's edition, because the Red Book itself, the big one, is so large, cumbersome, and difficult to use. But if it comes to looking at paintings and so on, of course, it's essential.
Yeah.
And 2009, I guess it was in October, November, the book was published. And I spent the Christmas holidays that year from 2009 to 10 reading it. And I got a German version as well. I read German pretty well and went back and forth between the English and the German. I must say I prefer the German. Original language is always better than the translation, but the translation isn't bad.
Yeah.
There are a number of errors, there always are. And then I did a couple of programs with the Asheville Jung Center, I think 2010 and 11, on the Red Book, and I was very excited about it at that time. And then my interest cooled off a little bit. There were conferences every now and then. I wrote a paper or two. And then in 2016, Thomas Arzt introduced himself to me at a class at ISAP where I teach. And Thomas Arzt was a German physicist, PhD in quantum physics, spent time at Princeton, and had discovered there wasn't so much in physics for him, so he looked for other resources, and he discovered a Jungian analyst in the Black Forest in Germany, a woman who had been a student of Mary Louise von Franz, and he worked with her, and that really changed his life. And he became very interested in Jungian analysis and working with the unconscious and with dreams and active imagination. And he was on fire about the Red Book. We had a lunch in 2016 at a very nice restaurant in Zurich. He proposed that we set up a series of courses and seminars and workshops on the Red Book at ISAP, which is an international school for analytical psychology really a training program for Jungian analysts in Zurich. I'm a training analyst there and a teacher. And at first I was sort of skeptical about this because by 2016, a lot had been written about the Red Book, published, and a lot of conferences and seminars. And I thought, is there really anything more to say about this? But I went along with his enthusiasm. He was very infectious, very convincing. And so we did that and did a program at ISAP. And then he came up with the idea of collecting papers by prominent Jungian analysts and scholars on the Red Book and publishing them in a series. And I said, are you kidding? A series? How many do you think we can get? He said, well, we just leave it open-ended. We'll just keep going as long as it goes. So we started with the first volume that was published in 17, I think, and then another one in 18. I think you have those two there. Mm-hmm. Published 4 with 70 authors, 70 authors.
I'm missing 3 and 4. Is that right?
There are 4. There's now a 5th volume. I'll tell you the story of that.
I'm way behind, man.
And he wanted to just leave it open-ended, keep going till, it peters out. But I was astonished at the amount of interest out there in the Jungian field. And the essays that we collected are all first-rate, really wonderful, classic pieces. All of them different, very diverse, taking Jung's Red Book from this angle, that angle. We called it Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And Thomas was something about a Naturphilosoph, if you know what that is in German, a philosopher. They call them nature philosophers. In other words, they take off from the natural world and speculate about the cosmos and about philosophical issues and so on. It's called Naturphilosophie. And he had edited a number of books in that field and was an expert. And he thought about the postmodern period as being very much a part of the beginning of a transition from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And it's a time of confusion, of uncertainty, of a lot of chaos, as transitions always are. It's a period of liminality. And so in the first volume that you've got there, volume 1 of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, he laid out his view of postmodernity, what it is, what it needs, and how Jung's Red Book is a response, or can be a response, to the important questions of our time, these questions of uncertainty. So we started thinking, how can the Red Book answer questions that are arising 100 years after Jung created it? So it's a hermeneutical enterprise. These essays are taking something written a good while ago and applying them to our time today, as well as being in their own right scholarly and very detailed analyses of various aspects of the Red Book. And then we were planning a conference to celebrate all of this at Eranos. And we called it the Eranos Symposium, Jung's Red Book for Our Time. And that was scheduled to take place in late April 2020. Well, guess what? COVID hit. COVID hit, and we had to postpone the conference. And Thomas became infected with COVID. He was one of the earliest I knew who had gotten it, and he was in his home in Germany. And I had a conversation with him. He looked very tired and a little bit of brain fog. He was an extremely intelligent man and hard driving, that German nonstop passion for things. But he really looked pretty down and pale. And then I got a message from his wife a couple of weeks later that he'd been taken to the hospital. And the doctor said, well, you have COVID, but that isn't your worst problem. You have a heart condition. Mm. So they rushed him to a hospital and did open heart surgery and did a couple of bypasses, I think. And he was recovering from that when he had a massive stroke, and that killed him. And that was on Easter Sunday, 2020. Oh. So he never lived to see this Eranos symposium, which did take place last year in 2022, just 2 years later than it had originally been scheduled. And we had 18 speakers, all of whom had contributed earlier papers to the series. And that's just been published. I received my copy on Christmas Eve day, in 22. Those are also outstanding papers, and that's the fifth in the series. So the series will come to an end with that volume, and it's dedicated to the memory of Thomas Arzt, who wasn't at the conference in the flesh, but we all felt that his spirit was very much there. And it was really a marvelous gathering of people who hadn't been at a conference in 2 years. And there was such a specialness to it, coming together for the first time from various parts of the world. And at this lovely place in Ascona on the mountain, Monte Verita, which is a international treasure owned by the ETH, the University in Zurich. And so we had a marvelous time, and those lectures can be viewed on YouTube. If you Google Eranos on YouTube, Eranos Symposium 2022, the 18 lectures have been put up on YouTube. You can watch them there.
Yeah, look below. I'll include a link for that, Murray, in the liner notes.
So that's I would say that my interest caught fire again from Thomas.
Oh, it sounds
between my earliest interest when it was published and the time of Thomas's arrival, a group of us at ISAP staged a performance called 7 Scenes from the Red Book. And we picked 7 important scenes where Jung is confronting Elijah and Salome and Isdabar and Philemon and so on, put them on stage, and we performed that really around the world. We did a performance in St. Petersburg, we did one in Taipei, we did one in Qingdao, China, where Richard Wilhelm had been a missionary, and of course in Zurich. We never did create a very good film of it. We had a kind of amateur film made. It's not too great, but I think maybe you can watch it at the Chiron. I think Chiron Publications put it on their website, or I think there's some access to it. But anyway, that was a great experience. And when we were in China, I'll never forget, in Qingdao, it's where the famous beer comes from. That's it was a German enclave. The Germans, before the First World War, were in the colonial business, and their colonial China office was located in Qingdao. And the old part of Qingdao looks like a German town, the buildings and so on, church structures. And we went there, and there were about 500 or 600 people in the audience, huge hall, and they had translated the text into Chinese, which was projected onto a screen. And so while the performers did the play in English, in the English translation, as we had learned it and memorized and so on, they could read it in Chinese. And afterwards, in the comments we received in the Q&A, a number of them said, we had no idea how much Jung suffered, and they were in tears. They had seen Jung as this scholarly, intellectual, but that he had suffered. And that's what you get in the Red Book. You get Jung's suffering. He suffers throughout the whole work. This is not a journey, into the heavens with the angels. It's a journey to hell, and down into the underworld. That's the Orphic journey, process, descending into the underworld and coming out again. And what he saw and experienced there was hair-raising. And he told his students afterwards there were times he would have to stop and do some breathing exercises to regain his composure. He was sweating, he said, sweating blood. And you do get that feeling. It's not pleasant to read it. The first time I read the Red Book, I was really quite put off. It's grueling. It's hard. It's not like reading a nice novel or a travel book or something. It is really tough going, and you have to think a lot as you go through it. You have to know a lot to appreciate it, and that's where Sonu's footnotes come in. So they're precious. They really give you a lot of background and connections to other parts of Jung's life and writings. And now the Black Books are also published, and the Black Books are the basis for the Red Book. They're Jung's journals that he used to create a manuscript for the Red Book. And so now we have the Black Books, but and we can look things up, and that gives us a lot more information about what's going on. But Sonu's footnotes are really extraordinary. I think there are 1,000 of them or so, and some are very lengthy and interesting. He pulls together a lot of material, very fine scholarship.
Well, it goes. I'm just paying attention to the way this conversation is starting, and what's fascinating is you're talking about all of these magnetic attractions, erotic attractions that happen to this book, and then it incarnates a sense of creativity. And so all these different people are saying, "Oh, let me take a swing at this." And what is this thing? And Rodney and I wrote an album about it, and I've read this book probably 5 times. It's a fascinating question about what this is, because we're talking about, to your conference point, that I never knew he suffered. This is the core question that happens in the Castle of the Forest when she says, feel this and feel what goes on underneath. This is not some just map that we need to identify and then we'll locate ourselves within the map. It's an encounter with something overwhelming and terrifying. And I think we're thirsty for that because there's such we don't have the underworld journey. That's been sanitized away. And
he didn't have it either. He had to make it for himself. What the Red Book has done for the Jungian field, and I'm very much a part of that and have been since 1970s, early 70s, trained at the Jung Institute in Zurich. So it's 50 years now. What it's done is reactivated the practice of active imagination, which had
that's interesting.
more or less fallen by the wayside in the meantime. So many other influences came into our field of analytical psychology from various different sources. And there's so much in Jung, the collected works which were being published in the 60s and 70s, that took a long time to digest. And what fell by the wayside in the practice of Jungian analysis was the use of active imagination. And now, with the publication of the Red Book, you see that active imagination is the key to the individuation process. As I've said to students at ISEP, you can go quite a ways in individuation, but if you want to go the full distance, as Jung describes it, you can't do it without doing active imagination. That is the key method.
Okay, this is good.
Working with dreams.
Sorry, because I want to take this thread because this is really important. You can I translate? Because I think what you're saying, and what I hear at least in what you're saying, is that there's a praxis that begins that involves standing aside of oneself, this ecstatic practice. So a practice that has long been based in a religious tradition is coming into this personal orientation where you can be confronted with others, other parts of yourself. And this gets at something I'm really interested in is what is the problem of our times that these images, whether it's this practice of psychedelics that Jung even mentions or Sanu mentions it at the beginning. It's on page like 27 of the introduction, and he says from the it was the transcripts from that Agnella, is that right?
Yeah, Agnella Jaffe, the protocols.
Where he says practice of active imagination is you allow the unconscious to express itself in the same way that one would do under the influence of mescaline. He's noting this. There's an overwhelming experience where you're no longer in charge and you're no longer kind of driving the ship. You're in the world of non-directed thinking and you're being encountered by these various parts of yourself. And that to me is coming online all over the place. And certainly Jung's Red Book is an indicator that we as a culture are needing the return of this inner landscape. Is that fair to say, or would you like to push up against it?
Well, I can agree with what you say, but there's more.
Yeah.
Jung's journey in the Red Book is what we get in the Red Book is not just the story of Jung observing something. It's the story of Jung changing. Jung says that when you get a big dream, for example, or an important symbol comes to you, whether it comes from mescaline or it comes from active imagination or it comes in a dream, it brings with it an ethical obligation. And he said the reason he isn't very keen on using a lot of drug activators, mescaline was the word he used,
sure.
Although he knew about LSD, which was invented in Switzerland. And now we have psilocybin and the mushrooms and all that, ayahuasca. He said the reason he doesn't recommend that is that people are going to get overwhelmed with it or they'll get addicted to it and they just want to have one after another experience. But each one brings with it an ethical obligation. And if you take your vision seriously, it's going to take you a lot of energy to put that to work. So what he got in the Red Book was the task for the rest of his life. It took him 40 years to fully, you could say, actualize and bring into his life, his lived life and his intellectual life, the teachings that he got in the Red Book and the symbols that he got in the Red Book. So if you want to take Jung seriously, you have to take the unconscious seriously. And it isn't something just to have a nice experience or have a big symbol and isn't it wonderful? Now life has meaning. No. The symbol will give your life meaning if you use it. But you can go to a Christian revival meeting and have a vision of Christ and be baptized, and 2 days later you're back to your old life.
Yeah.
Or it can change your life like it did Paul's.
Yeah.
Paul went out into the desert for 3 years after his vision to absorb it and digest it. And then he came and he was an apostle. This doesn't just happen to you. You have the symbol, you have the vision, you have the experience, and then what?
Yes.
Work begins.
Yeah.
So these people who are, throwing down psilocybin in order to get rid of their anxiety, maybe it does that. It has a nice, benefit to old people who suffer from chronic anxiety and depression. It kind of gets them over that, and then they can be happy again. Well, that's a medical benefit, but that isn't what Jung has in mind with the experience of the unconscious. It's a whole different game.
Well, it does seem to me that because you hear these themes all the time, like what's the problem of our culture, and I think Kingsley at one point notes the Western cult of individualism, and Jung writes often about how these misnomers around individuation and individualism.
Yeah.
We're awash with individualism and collective
We're washed
innovation
with
and technology.
egotism. That's
Yeah.
egotism.
Okay. Yes. So couldn't we say that on some level, because that's the spell that entrances us, this egoism, that there's something so enormous that needs to captivate us, that it can come in the form of a overwhelming event. We just don't have the religious practices of incubation any longer, and Lord knows I'm looking.
Well, those religious practices of incubation changed people. Jung goes through, in the Red Book, he goes through, you could say, a mystery initiation.
Yeah. Yes.
An initiation into the mysteries of the unconscious. That's what he learned. And then he tells his students, this changed my life. This changed my way of thinking. This changed my way of working. Changed my way of living. So when you have the experience, it's wonderful, but it's the beginning. So the Red Book is the beginning of Jung. Before the Red Book, Jung was a Freudian. After the Red Book, he was a Jungian. Jung became a Jungian through this experience. What we know as Jungianism comes about because he had this experience. Now, what Kingsley writes about is, in the ancient world, pre-Socratic philosophy, the physician and the prophet were one. There was no distinction between science and mystical vision.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Pythagoras was a scientist and he was a mystic. Now, what you have now is a division. You either have scientists or you have mystics or the secular person. And what you talk about is what is our time, what is the need of our time, and the desperate need is that if you're a scientist, you live in the intellect. If you're a secularist, maybe you live in politics or you live in your hobbies or, whatever gives your life meaning in the small m sense of meaning. But what is lacking in both areas is what Jung would call soul. There is no soul. Modern Man in Search of His Soul. That's one of his most famous titles. And what is the soul? Yeah. It isn't just your subjectivity. It isn't just your feelings. People think, if I go into therapy and get in touch with my feelings, then I'll have soul. Then I'll know what I feel, what I want. All of that is beneficial. And thank God for psychotherapy. But that isn't soul. Soul comes to you from the unconscious. Soul is Salome, or the figure called soul here. And she's autonomous, and she teaches Jung. She doesn't tell Jung what to feel or how to feel. She has her own mind, and Jung has to pay attention to her. And she's not easy. She's demanding. And she changes. So, his ideas expressed much later. If you work with the unconscious, not only does your consciousness change, but your unconscious changes. Well, he got that from his experience with Salome. She was blind, and when he suffered on the cross, she received her sight. She got vision. So if the anima is blind, you're rudderless. Your soul is blind. What does that mean? It means, you don't know what to take hold of. You don't know if you should go in this direction or that. You consult your whimsical feelings. They change every minute. You don't have a vocation. You don't have a direction. The soul will give you a direction, but she has to see and she has to be able to talk to you. And so this conversation that he has with soul and then with Philemon, he learns from Philemon what is magic. He goes to Philemon the magician. That's one of the scenes we did in the play. And Philemon plays with him, doesn't want to tell him, but Philemon is a magician. And his disguise as Philemon is revealed in the last scene of Scrutinies, where Christ is in the garden, and he looks at Philemon and he says, "Oh, you're Simon Magus, the old magician." Simon Magus is a biblical figure, in the book of Acts, you can read about him. And he came to the apostles because he wanted the secret, and he said he would pay for it. How can you heal people? You've got something called the Holy Spirit. I see you can heal people. You can speak in other language. I'm going to pay you. Tell me that secret so I can do it too. They threw him out. And he went off to Egypt and founded a Gnostic sect. So that's Philemon. But he has magic. And what he teaches Jung is that in order to do magic, you have to give up your thinking. Now, Jung is a committed thinking type. He's a scientist. He's a medical doctor. He's a researcher. If you read his early writings, it's all thinking. Mm-hmm. After the Red Book, it isn't all thinking. He's still thinking, but there's something else to it. It's what von Franz said, Jung's writings have a double bottom. There's a rational and there's a non-rational. And that's why he's kind of hard to read for many people, because he jumps around, he associates, and if you stick with it long enough, you start seeing it isn't just the surface meaning. There's something else going on underneath. And that double level is what he brings out of the Red Book. You have a rational conscious level, and then there's another level that's playing along with it. And that other level gives it depth. That's why it's called depth psychology. And when you go to the university and study psychology, you just get the one level. You get the rational level. You get the experiments. It's valuable. You learn a lot about how the human brain works and how perception works and memory works. It's not useless information, but it's not deep. Depth psychology has this other dimension. The unconscious is involved in it. It's symbolic.
So this reminds me of something that, and I included this in our email when I was kind of free associating for this conversation. Jeff Kripal said something to me a long time ago, that writing is performative, and that's something that has become abundantly clear for me when reading a book like the Red Book. When Jung says something like, "Go write your own," like stop imitating, because there's a lot of this idea of the imitatio Christi and what the line is around that. But I think that double layer, which is just occurring to me, thank you for delineating this, is that he is in a process of discovery. It's not regurgitating information to communicate. I mean, if my intention is to say, "Hi, I've learned all this shit, and I'm going to throw it over to you, and you can take it in now," versus I'm going to expose to you a confrontation and a collision of my inner experiences that are somewhat allegorized in this dramatic form that will encounter you, and therefore tap into your capacity to do that. And so you might experience some weird feelings when you're. That's the book to me. Is that other layer is so refreshing, quite frankly.
That's what students discover at ISAP. They come and they get immersed in this program. It's a full immersion residential program, and so you're in it for a period of years, and they start dreaming about alchemy. Yeah. They think, "Oh, it's because I'm reading alchemy." No, the unconscious is alchemical. That's what Jung discovered in his alchemy studies, which comes after the Red Book. The alchemists were engaged in active imagination, and they were allowing the unconscious to show itself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In their fantasies, in their projections. The unconscious showed itself and showed what it is doing. It's going through a transformation. It's separating and it's uniting and it's going through stages. And so Jung studied that, and he said, "My goodness, what they're showing us in alchemy is what I experienced in the Red Book. This is a process of transformation going on in the unconscious." And when students come and start reading Jung and hearing the lectures and so on, they get a certain surface level, but something else starts going on inside them. And that comes out then in their dreams, because they're also in analysis at the same time. And so It's a process in which the student gets the information that's contained in the writings and lectures and all that, but it activates a process, or it opens them to a process that's their own. And you won't dream Jung's dreams. You won't have Jung's active imagination. You will have yours. That's his message. Make your own red book, he says. Yes. And that's what Thomas Arzt, actually, there was a friend of Thomas Arzt in Germany who was a craftsman, and he made a number of red books exactly to the size, measurement, and quality and everything of Jung's red book. Jung had it designed and made for him by a bookmaker, not a bookmaker, but the people who make the physical books in Zurich. And he told them what he wanted, and they made it for him. And that became the red book that he inscribed his calligraphic script into. So Thomas Arzt had this friend who made it for him, and he was, at the end of his life, he was taking his dreams and creating a transcript and starting to write his own red book. Well, that is a suggestion that Jung makes. It is a kind of imitation, but the material is yours. It's not his. You aren't rewriting his material, but you're making your own. And I think Lionel Corbett, he was a student in Chicago. I know him well. He lives in California now. He's a professor at Pacifica, has written a couple of books on Jung and spirituality, and it's very much along that line. You create your own private religion, so to speak, from your active imagination and dreams. It's what Wolfgang Pauli did. And Wolfgang Pauli came to Jung as a young man, very confused and a mess. Brilliant, cognitively, but emotionally a total mess. And went into analysis with a student of Jung's, and then worked with Jung and started recording his dreams and active imagination, turned his life completely around. Yeah. And his dreams now, somebody told me they're like 30 or 40 volumes in the archives in Geneva, and they're being prepared for publication. Jung selected like 100 of the early ones, and he wrote a commentary on them. That's part 2 of volume 12 in the collected works, Psychology and Alchemy. Those are Wolfgang Pauli's dreams and active imagination. And Jung takes the symbols and shows what the unconscious is doing, where it's going. And this was a preparation for Pauli's individuation process. So, as I said, what the Red Book has done is bring the importance of active imagination for individuation back into the practice of Jungian analysis in a way that it couldn't have been done otherwise. Everybody who worked with Jung after the Red Book experience did active imagination. They all did it.
Explain that. Because I know that people are like, how do you do that? What is that even? Like, what is that?
Red Book, you'll see how you do it. Jung shows you exactly how you do it. You sit quietly and wait.
That's right.
First step is clear your mind, open it up, and wait. And then wait for an image.
Yeah.
And when an image comes, you might have to wait quite a long time. I think it's, 10 or 15 days he's in the desert before he hears a voice, that's soul speaking. And what she says is, wait. So he's frustrated, but then he starts talking to her, and then Salome and Elijah appear later. The first one, though, is he goes into the cave. Remember, you referenced that in your message to me. That was his first image. He sees a cave, and he goes into it, and it's muddy.
And there's a floating head.
And floating heads and blood and gory, horrible.
So that's a great. There's such a wild man from the perspective of academia that studies the wildest stuff that's out there, named Amen Hillman, and he talks about, he reads Greek 6-7 hours a day, and when he encountered the Red Book, he this passage he pointed it out to me and said that is part of the Orphic tradition. He's making a direct reference to the Orphic tradition. Yeah. Hence, that's this curiosity, like, wait a second, where, because I get into this weird space of when we talk about the mysteries, on the one hand, we're talking about these social communities that developed around an alternate state of experience, I imagine. I imagine somebody has a religious experience, they become somewhat touched by the prophetic vision, people congregate around it, and the mysteries traditions are born, saying that here's your process to stand beside yourself and reflect on existence. That to me sounds like a process to connect with the mystery. But these Orphics were actively engaged in the practice and conceptualization and connection with the underworld, which we totally lack on a lot of levels today.
Yeah. Well, for us, the underworld is the unconscious. Yeah. Christianity was a kind of mystery religion at the beginning. The community lived in catacombs or worshipped in catacombs, hidden places, because they were being persecuted and so on. And then when it came out into the open, became an official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, it became more conventional and orthodox and took on the flavor of the society in which it had entered into, namely the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. So the church was modeled on the emperor system. You've got a guy at the top and then everything else follows underneath. So they set it up so there's a pope and then there are archbishops and bishops and so on down the line. And in the process of organizing itself and entering into the society and adapting to the society, they gained a lot. In other words, they took over the world, the known world, but they lost a lot. They lost the mystery. And mystery has to remain very quiet, very private, and very secret. The Eleusinian mysteries, which were practiced just outside of Athens at Eleusis, and Carl Jung wrote a wonderful book about it. Mm-hmm. They were practiced over centuries, and not once was the secret of the mysteries revealed to anybody who was not a member of the cult. It was absolutely, they committed themselves to secrecy, to the secret. So keeping the secret, Jung writes about that occasionally too, keeping the secret is very important if it's a precious secret. It isn't just being secretive and hiding your shadow and stuff like that. Keeping a secret that is the essence of who you are, of your most personal, your deepest identity. Keep that to yourself. Or to a very few, your analyst maybe. T.S. Eliot wrote that every cat has three names. There's a name that everybody knows. There's a name that only a few people that are intimately related to the cat. And there's a name that only the cat knows. And when you see the cat looking in the far distance, looking at the sunset, what it's doing is thinking about the name that only it knows. That's a secret.
I love that.
And that's why Jung hid the Red Book in his private office, in his drawer. He didn't publish it. He didn't publish it for maybe another reason, that it would make him look very non-Swiss and not like a conventional scientist. And he was worried about his persona and all of that. But this was another reason. If you spill it out all over the place, it loses its value. It becomes a cliche. If you use the same word too often, you have to take it out. You read through your text and you see you've used the same word 25 times in 2 paragraphs. You have to start taking it out. It becomes commonplace, has no value anymore. Mm-hmm. So overuse. So there are some things that only you or a very few people keep to yourself. And that's the mystery. The word mystery means secret. Look it up, the etymology. It means keeping the secret. So when you have these deep experiences and you want to live with them and by them, you do that in your own way, privately. And Jung did it by writing, but he never referenced his Red Book in his other writings, except Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where chapter 6, Confrontation with the Unconscious, he talks about it a little bit, but he never quotes from it directly. He doesn't say, as I experienced. All right, let me tell you what I experienced in his writings. Never. Only a few people ever saw the Red Book. Very few special people. Mary Louise von Franz and Peter Baines and a couple of other people, his wife Emma, of course, and Tony Wolfe. But it was very closely held.
So I've got a question then, because at one point I was with this group. We were out in the hill country of Texas, about 4 or 5 of us, studying the Red Book with an amazing analyst who's since died, named Priscilla Murr. She was a lovely human.
Well.
Oh, Priscilla.
Yeah,
So she was
she
was amazing. I had the gift of her teaching me, and so I love this story. We were out at this little ranch and in a small group studying the Red Book for about 3 days. And the guy who owned the ranch is also a Jungian analyst. And Priscilla trying to set him up for hey, look at my students and what do you think about the Red Book? And as he's walking by, he goes, it's just another religion. And then leaves. And I remember this, here I am, this like eager student, this novice who's ready to learn. And I'm seeing the collision between don't be a practitioner. You see it in religious studies, right? Don't be a practitioner. Have distance. Don't be seduced by the tradition. So, what does that stir up for you?
When the Red Book was published, it was among Jungian analysts. There was quite a division between people who were celebrating it and people who thought it was a very bad idea. Here in Zurich, it was, I wouldn't say equally divided. I think most people were eager to read it and at least see what was there. But the ones who were against it were afraid of a couple of things. One was that it would diminish Jung's reputation as a psychoanalyst and a scientist, and it would show that he was really a weird guy. When I was a student, there was a story going around that I heard a rumor that in the Red Book, and this was whispered, in the Red Book, Jung claims that he's a reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Did you know that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it isn't so far from the truth. I mean, it comes close, doesn't it? And Jung calls this the Liber Novus.
Yeah.
But this was his religious experience. And it was his New Testament. Liber Novus means the new book.
Yeah.
I don't think he meant it to be a New Testament for other people in the sense that the Bible is a book for many people, written by others than Jesus Christ himself, and many years after Christ's death. But it certainly was Jung's deepest religious experience, at least until he had those visions in the 1940s when he was in the hospital, and he had these important visions of the mystic marriage that he writes about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. That was a second stage, but it was different from the Red Book. The difference between active imagination and taking drugs, just to go back to that, and I think that's an important point, is that in active imagination, the ego, the I, who you are in your waking life, is a part of the drama. And it's not weakened or diminished by anything, by alcohol, drugs, anything. It is fully empowered. And you can turn it off anytime you want to. So the ego is in control. Mm-hmm. But what the ego does is voluntarily, drugs force this. And Jung once said that drugs are a rape of the soul. It rapes it, rips it open. You don't have control over it. In active imagination, you voluntarily open yourself to whatever will emerge. And you wait, and when it comes, you receive it. Step 1 is clear your mind and wait. Step 2 is whatever comes, receive it. Don't edit it. Don't say it's not good enough, it's not interesting, it's bullshit. Stay with it and follow it. And if it moves, follow it some more. And if you can engage it, eventually you will come upon figures, you will come upon a scene. Anybody who really actively perseveres in active imagination and I've worked now with a lot of people who do it as they work in analysis with me, they encounter figures. They encounter interesting personalities, images that we then work with in analysis. They paint, they draw, they make a part of their lives. It's a part of their transformation process. But this opening and closing is under the direction of the ego. So I tell people, if you want to do active imagination, set aside 20 or 30 minutes, put on the alarm, and go in. First time, simply open yourself to the blank. Clear your mind. Not so easy. Clear your mind and wait. If thoughts intrude, put them aside. Just wait for an image to come. And when it comes, oh, there's a rabbit. What's that doing here? Follow it. When it comes, engage it, no matter what it is. And continue working with that image, if an image comes, till the alarm goes off, then stop and write down what you've experienced or not experienced. Day 2, go back to where you left off on day 1. And continue. Again, time, 30 minutes, that's enough. And do this for 30 days consecutively. Whether anything happens or not, on some days something will, other days it won't. And after 30 days, you will have an inner space, an inner room or an inner landscape, a place you can go to continue your work at any time you want to. And you can take into that space your problems, your questions, your dreams. You can work further on your dreams. As Jung says, you can use active imagination to deepen your dreams, take them further, take them another step. But what you do in this first 30 days is create an inner space where that kind of work can be done. And it will always be there. It's constant. It doesn't change. The way dreams are, you can't predict them. They're always different. There's always something going on in dreams. Active imagination, you can clear a space and go back to it and back to it and back to it as long as you want to. And that has a kind of magical property to it.
Yeah, no doubt.
So Jung writes about this, that true imagination, as he calls it, he writes in his alchemy, true imagination creates. If God imagines something, he creates the world. It immediately materializes. If human beings imagine, with true imagination, Jung says, they create subtle bodies. Subtle bodies are neither real nor not real. They're imaginal bodies, these subtle bodies. And if you work with these subtle bodies and you paint them or you create a sculpture, as Jung did with many of his, Bollingen, his tower at Bollingen was an active imagination. Synchronistic things happen around these objects. And he said, I can't say more about it, I just am hinting at it. But they do have the capacity, a true symbol has the capacity to constellate synchronicity. Okay, what is synchronicity? It's the interaction between the psychical world and the material world from another location behind both of them that unites them and brings something into the world. It's an act of creation. Jung says synchronicity is an act of creation. Something into the world in 2 spots, in the psyche and in the material world. That's a synchronicity. And those synchronicities have meaning. And he and Wolfgang Pauli worked a lot on this question of meaning. How do you discover the meaning in synchronicity? You don't make it up. It's delivered to you. And it comes from a depth of the unconscious that Jung called the collective unconscious, or the archetypal, or the self. So these what starts out as active imagination can move into true creation and the creation of symbols that have an uncanny way of delivering meaning or direction or vocation.
Okay, let me take this thread. So I'm going to go a little bit into the underworld. What do you think all this talk of murder and child sacrifice is? You know, when you see that in the Red Book, what does your mind and experience connect with that? Because the one scene in particular, which is quite wild and yeah, anybody to hear about, is a pretty intense scene.
Yeah. Well, Soul is sitting there with a dead child. And Jung says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, this child has been murdered." And Jung kind of feels sorry for the child. And then Soul says, "Eat the liver." And he says, "What? I'm not going to do that. I would never do that. Eat the liver of this dead child." She says, "Eat the liver." So he eats the liver. And what that does is, what he's doing is integrating the inferior function feeling, just to put it in theoretical terms.
Yeah.
Because inferior function is the feeling function. And he writes a lot about how difficult it is for him to love. Love is a big problem for Jung. When the word is mentioned, he runs for cover. It scares him. And he has to learn to integrate his feeling of love. And that's what that brings him. It brings him compassion for the suffering of the world at a level that is not just cognitive. Oh, the poor children in Ukraine. Aren't they suffering now? All those bombs dropping on them. There's no water. Isn't that terrible? Would you like another drink, honey? That's the way we treat that. You get it on the news and it lasts 30 seconds and then you're off to something
Amnesia.
else.
Yeah.
If you eat the liver, you don't go off to anything else. You're digesting it. You're eating it. And that's what Jung does throughout the Red Book. He's eating it. That's integration. That's what he means you have to do with symbols. You have to eat them. You have to take them into your body and make them you. They are part of you.
This imagery is one that brings up the most detestable, disgusting, horrendous feeling, right? That the feeling of having to do that is overwhelming. But
then he has the Liverpool dream. Remember that?
Yeah.
Well, the liver is a very important symbol for Jung.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the seat of life. And the liver of the child is, you could say, the seat of eternal life. But that scene, as grotesque and harsh as it is, and we played that scene in the play, and the man who played Jung in the play, Paul Brucci, could barely say the lines when he did that, and he was retching. That's what the audience saw. We had no idea he suffered like that. He is suffering. And he didn't voluntarily ask for that scene. That came to him. And it's delivered by Soul. She's sitting there with a drape. He doesn't know who she is at first. And then she pulls back her hood, and he sees, oh, that's Soul, capital S, Soul. He's a figure in the Red Book. His soul brings him that. That's what soul brings you. Your inferior function, grotesque things, but you have to digest them. And that's the meaning of that scene. It's a very important scene. And I'm going to have to stop.
I know. It's also very, very scary for a culture that seeks comfort at every step of the journey. Murray, hey, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Stein, it's a pleasure. Thank you. This is so worthy of a conversation, and I appreciate the container to dig into all this material. And
pleasure to speak with you, John. Thanks care.
Thanks a lot, man. You too.
Do my best to Rodney, please.
I will. Totally. Yes, okay. I will. Thanks, man.